One of everyone's favorite factions from all of the Fallout games is the NCR, and when you look at the Desert Rangers with their helmets with those red eyepieces, it's pretty easy to understand why. After all, just like how the Brotherhood looks pretty badass in their power armor, the NCR also look pretty awesome in their dusters, body armor, and in those helmets. However, what is unfortunate is that the NCR never really made their way into Fallout 4. On the one hand, this is understandable considering that the NCR is essentially on the other side of the American wasteland. On the other hand, it sort of makes you wonder what exactly is going on with the NCR. Are they thriving? Are they in rough shape, or have they been totally destroyed? Today, I'd like to discuss what happened to the NCR in the years since the events of New Vegas and speculate about how they are currently doing during the events of Fallout 4. But without further ado, let's talk about how the NCR differs from most of the other factions and how they got involved in the events of Fallout New Vegas in the first place. The NCR, unlike most of the other Wasteland factions, represents progress in the Wasteland as they're really the only faction that seems to be rebuilding society. Now, while Fallout 4 alludes to the idea that the Brotherhood also appeared to have some kind of civilization, we know for a fact that the NCR is sort of like our own modern society in the sense that most people aren't fighting for survival. But I think I'll let Cassandra Moore explain what the NCR is all about.
I don't have time to discuss all the different aspects of the NCR with you, but if you want it all in a nutshell, the NCR is progress. If you wander around the wasteland, you'll find all sorts of tribes, villages, and such where people spend most of their time trying to survive. The NCR gives its citizens a shot at something more. We have laws, currency, healthcare, government, all the things that were lost. It's not perfect, but it's worth protecting, which is why we also have the largest military in existence.
So, unlike a lot of the tribes, various factions, and random towns that exist in the American Wasteland in the Fallout series, the NCR somewhat resembles our very own society in the current day. And while we don't really ever visit places with formal governments like our own in any of the Fallout games, they definitely are out there waiting to be explored in future games. Now, as for why the NCR are in the Mojave during the events of New Vegas, I think Dennis Crocker can explain that, as well as the NCR's current relationship with Mr. House, who controls the New Vegas Strip during most of the events of Fallout New Vegas.
I can provide a quick history lesson, if that's what you're looking for. In 2274, President Kimball sent the NCR Army into the Mojavean force with the objective of occupying and repairing Hoover Dam. Rangers and Army scouts had confirmed that the dam was basically unoccupied and could be restored to an operable condition. Upon arriving at the dam, however, they discovered that a large force of tribals and robots had occupied it. This was our introduction to the three families, the Securitrons and, of course, Mr. House. Using his Securitrons as intermediaries, Mr. House called for parley. He claimed his forces had occupied Hoover Dam in order to safeguard it for our arrival, and that he was ready to turn it over to us, so long as we could agree to terms. Those terms became the Treaty of New Vegas. The treaty recognized Mr. House's sovereignty over the Strip and granted us rights to establish military bases at the dam and McCarran Airport. The NCR is legally permitted to send 95% of the electricity produced by the dam to our home states. The remaining 5% goes to the Strip. The treaty actually makes it illegal for the NCR to prevent its citizens or troops on furlough from visiting the Strip. Once on the Strip, our citizens are subject to arrest or punishment by House's Securitrons, though that's a rare occurrence. Our troops enjoy a different status. It's illegal for the Securitrons to take action against them. Of course, it's also illegal for our troops to carry firearms on the Strip, so there isn't much trouble they can get into. Our military police does an adequate job of keeping the troops on furlough in line. I don't envy them that task. The embassy was established a few weeks after the treaty was signed. Basically, Mr. House handed us a dumpy little building he had no interest in renovating. I'm the third ambassador to hold this post, and the first, I think, to accept its limitations. My predecessors had ambitions of engineering the annexation of the Mojave. They thought they'd convince Mr. House to join up. I've never even spoken to the man, or whatever he is. Maybe the situation will change once we've beaten the Legion once and for all.
So as Dennis just described, the NCR entered the Mojave with the goal of occupying and controlling the Hoover Dam. However, upon reaching the dam, they encountered Mr. House's Securitrons, as well as the three families. Now, Mr. House called for a parley and entered negotiations with the NCR, and the terms of those negotiations became what would be eventually known as the Treaty of New Vegas. Now, this treaty ensured that Mr. House would retain control of the New Vegas Strip, complete with his own police force of Securitrons, and in exchange, the NCR would be given the ability to build military bases near the dam and at the McCarran Airport. Also, the NCR is allowed to use 95% of the power generated by the dam for its other territories. Though, as Dennis sort of alludes to towards the end of that history lesson he just gave, the Treaty of New Vegas has put the NCR into a somewhat undesirable position. Originally, the NCR had intended on annexing New Vegas and making it a NCR territory, and while it was possible for the NCR to attack and defeat the three families, as well as Mr. House and his Securitrons, they ultimately chose not to do so out of fear for Caesar's Legion, or at the very least, that is what Mr. House seems to indicate.
Indeed it was, and still is, but not without taking significant casualties. Would Kimball and Oliver have traded the lives of hundreds of soldiers for absolute control of Hoover Dam? Oh, yes. They weren't afraid of me. They were afraid of Caesar, that attacking me would leave them vulnerable to a Legion offensive. And so they negotiated, not out of the kindness of their hearts, as they try to make it seem, because the calculus of power left no other choice.
Upon further questioning, Robert House also reveals that he used the provisions of the Treaty of New Vegas to help stimulate his economic interests for New Vegas at what would ultimately be the NCR's expense.
NCR forces were permitted to occupy Hoover Dam and establish a military base at McCarran Airport. Well, it used to be one. They recognized my sovereignty over the Vegas Strip and agreed to supply electricity and water once their engineers repaired the dam. Written into the treaty were provisions that the NCR do nothing to prevent its soldiers and civilians from visiting the Strip. That's how I harnessed the NCR to my endeavor. Their occupation has been the engine of my growing economy.
So as you can see, the NCR is in a position to where it has to protect the Strip, but they can't tax Mr. House's casinos to help fund their military campaigns in the Mojave. And while the NCR could just attack Mr. House and win, the casualties would be far too high, and they would risk becoming vulnerable to Caesar's Legion. The NCR also can't just leave the Mojave because the NCR has become heavily dependent on the Hoover Dam. After all, 95% of the power generated helps power some of the NCR's other territories and supplements them with water. So when the player finally gets to play as the courier in the game, the player can choose to take advantage of the NCR and help Robert House or help themselves rise to power. The player can help the Legion rise to power, or the courier can alleviate the NCR of Mr. House and the Legion and help the NCR obtain complete control of New Vegas. With this in mind, the courier's decision to help one of the three factions or to help create an independent New Vegas will definitely be able to tell us a lot about the NCR during the events of Fallout 4. But let's quickly summarize each ending. You have the NCR Victory, which, according to the ending slide, basically says that the NCR established complete control over the Mojave Wasteland. And then eventually, many of the local communities, including the Strip, are annexed and effectively become a part of the NCR and adopt its government. You have the Mr. House Victory, where the ending card says that Mr. House successfully pushed both the Legion and NCR out of New Vegas, and then from there, we're led to speculate that Mr. House controls the Mojave with Securitron robots. You have the Independent New Vegas ending, which can vary depending on whether the player has upgraded the Securitrons or not. And finally, you have the Legion ending, which can vary based on whether Caesar is killed or not. However, in this ending, the NCR are pushed back to the Mojave outpost, and the Legion end up occupying all major towns and enslave the majority of the population. And in a certain sense, like the NCR, the Legion establish its own form of government and rules in the Mojave and in New Vegas. Now, normally, I would pick a canon ending, and my pick for the canon ending would be the NCR Victory. But since no one really knows what the canon ending is, and given that there's a lot of debate within the community about which ending is canon, I figured I would go over what the NCR's fate is during the events of Fallout 4, depending on who has control of New Vegas by the events of Fallout 4. Let's start with the NCR Victory. As I've stated previously, the NCR Victory eventually leads to New Vegas becoming an NCR territory, and it's safe to say that with Mr. House out of the picture and the Legion defeated, that the NCR would have little in the form of rivals in the region, and it's likely that New Vegas would be almost unrecognizable in the 6 or 7 years that followed the NCR's victory. While New Vegas is an untamed wasteland during the events of Fallout New Vegas, I suspect that it would eventually become a major settlement for the NCR, and perhaps, as Cassandra Moore said, New Vegas will have an official governing body complete with tax collection, healthcare programs, and many of the other necessary pieces of infrastructure needed for a modern society. As for the NCR as an organization, I suspect that the NCR would probably continue to expand. Perhaps they would go north, however, it seems that continued eastern expansion would be the most logical choice, especially since the Legion and the NCR are at war, and it would be wise of the NCR to take their territories as quickly as possible. As to how far the NCR would have progressed in this endeavor, I would say that the NCR may or may not have control over the Grand Canyon during the events of Fallout 4, which is where Caesar's Legion originates. Perhaps after that, the NCR would expand into more northern parts of Nevada and Utah, and then eventually into parts of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. And ultimately, an NCR victory would mean more expansion for the organization, in my opinion. But then there's the Mr. House victory. If Mr. House were to win and expel both the NCR and the Legion from New Vegas territories, this could potentially have dire consequences for the NCR. After all, the NCR would lose control of Hoover Dam, which is supplying power to some of their other territories. I also suspect that the loss of Hoover Dam would greatly affect the economy of the NCR as well, as they would lose the potential water supply the dam could provide. Plus, I doubt they would be able to trade with New Vegas, as they're not really on great terms with Mr. House. However, with this said, at least initially, I don't think Mr. House's victory would be a total death blow to the NCR, and while I think the NCR would definitely be demoralized, and in the process of recovery during the events of Fallout 4 following a Mr. House victory, they're going to need to move relatively fast if they ever plan on retaking New Vegas. Mr. House mentions in some dialogue that his goal is to revitalize the tech sector in 20 years, have people in orbit in 50 years, and his ultimate goal is to travel into outer space to colonize other planets within 100 years. And if the NCR waits too long to retake New Vegas, it's possible that Mr. House would possess technology that far outpaces the NCR to the point that they couldn't effectively mount a resistance to it. And at that point, what would be stopping Mr. House from attacking the NCR at their weakest? Perhaps the NCR senses this and they're attacking Robert House during the events of Fallout 4 in one final attempt to crush Mr. House and finally take back New Vegas. If that's the case, then for their sakes, they better hope they succeed. There's also the independent New Vegas ending. As far as the NCR is concerned, I think they could potentially retake New Vegas if the Courier decided to form an independent New Vegas and install themselves as the de facto leader. And while I suppose the Courier could take on some of Mr. House's projects, I also think that it's just as likely that the Courier will do little beyond upgrading Mr. House's Securitrons. And if the Courier doesn't upgrade the Securitrons, it's sort of like Mr. House said earlier on in this video, that the NCR could take New Vegas by force. But really, if you ask me, the independent New Vegas ending could go either way for the NCR. The NCR could be in a situation like I described for a Mr. House victory, or things could be far less severe for the NCR, and they simply just have to invade New Vegas with enough troops. And once they've taken care of the Courier and his independent New Vegas, then they can move on to the Legion. Speaking of the Legion, we also should discuss the Caesar's Legion victory. If Caesar were victorious, you would likely see a lot of what the Legion ending describes, particularly when it comes to the enslavement of New Vegas and a lot of the surrounding Mojave. Though I suspect that the NCR may still have some presence in the region, as the Legion ending does mention that the NCR have been pushed back to the NCR outpost. As mentioned previously, one of the reasons that the NCR are staying in New Vegas is to prevent the Legion from crossing the Colorado River, and since that would have happened with the NCR's loss at the Second Battle of Hoover Dam, the Legion may actually be in a position to push further into NCR territory. And for that reason, it's possible that the NCR could be wiped out by the time of the events of Fallout 4. It just depends on how fast the Legion can conquer territories. I think the big question, though, is how much longer does Caesar himself have to live? Now, during the events in New Vegas, Caesar almost dies and enters a coma, and while Caesar can be saved, you have to wonder just how long Caesar can control New Vegas before he dies. Assuming Caesar dies during the events of New Vegas, it's basically confirmed that Legate Lanius would assume control of the Legion. Interestingly, it's implied that Lanius is someone who isn't particularly liked, and even Caesar himself basically says that, quote, "Some would call Lanius a great man, but I'm not sure he qualifies." Other NPCs, like Vulpes and Culta, express sadness over Caesar's death and imply that it's unfortunate that Legate Lanius would gain control of the Legion. As to how this could potentially pertain to the NCR, some of the political rivalries between Lanius and someone like Vulpes and Culta could be used as a method to destabilize the Legion as a whole, and if Legate Lanius were to take control of the Legion and actually take New Vegas, perhaps NCR spies could make contacts with other key Legion officials and undermine Lanius's rule by attempting to start infighting amongst the Legion's incorporated tribes. Then, when the Legion is weak, the NCR could attack and then retake New Vegas. While we can't say for sure, my thinking is that Caesar is probably dead by the events of Fallout 4, and if Caesar hasn't picked a successor, then Legate Lanius could gain control of the Legion and possibly also be its demise. From there, the NCR could pick up the pieces and reform settlements in the Mojave and in New Vegas. At the end of the day, and if you ask me, the NCR is either expanding eastward or they're attempting to retake New Vegas so they can begin to expand eastward. And perhaps they're fighting a losing battle against the Legion or Mr. House, or maybe they're on the verge of a major comeback and will return to power in New Vegas. My guess is that eventually, perhaps some 30 to 40 years or more after the events of Fallout 4, that the NCR and either the Minutemen and or Brotherhood of Steel will end up meeting one another. And once they do, it's going to be fascinating to see exactly how all of the factions we've seen in the games up to this point end up interacting with one another. Will the Minutemen and NCR see eye to eye, or will the Brotherhood and NCR enter a full-scale war? I guess we're just going to have to wait and see. But alright guys, I think that's going to wrap up this particular video. If you liked this video, feel free to leave a like, click the bell to join the notification squad, and as always, take care, and I'll see y'all next time.